primarily through operating as a hub for the New Paradigm Coalition. So this enables us to give a more fully rounded approach to our organization and how that might bear upon the coalition. And so we wanted to, in keeping with the organization of last week, which was so great, Farananda and Arthur Brock, to actually begin with our presentation and then do the breakouts afterwards. And depending on the size of the group, we might decide to do breakouts or not. But so shall we commence, Juliet? And then we planned it for about 15 minutes, and we'll see if we can stick to that, so we could have plenty of time for conversations. So I'm going to go first, and then I'll be passing to Juliet and Sage. And so we're a 501c3 founded in 2020. We're an amicable spinoff of another nonprofit, the Evolution Institute, which was founded in 2008. And in many ways, we go back to a program that I created at Binghamton University called EVOS for Evolutionary Studies, which taught evolution across the curriculum. And both Sage and Juliet are actually products of EVOS, Binghamton University graduate students, and so graduates. And so in many ways, some ways we're young, and in other ways we go back over 20 years. Our purpose, to consciously evolve to a world that works for all. Our differentiator is that we take that word evolution very seriously. And so we bring modern evolutionary science, any context, any scale. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say we're the only organization that serves this purpose. I like to loosely compare ourselves with the Santa Fe Institute and other institutes for complex systems science. And to say that we're striving to be a hub like that for evolutionary science, which is a different body of knowledge. But everything else about our organization is actually quite different from the Santa Fe Institute. But there is a niche for that, and we're currently the only organization filling that niche. Happy to have company. So next slide, Juliet. So this means that given the generality of evolutionary science, we can cover all topics and do. It makes it hard to sometimes describe our organization because other organizations have a specific topical focus, whereas we literally can spread in all directions, such as the ones listed here. And I think that very much lends itself to the New Paradigm Coalition, because the concept of economics that we're embracing is an embedded economy, embedded in political, social, and environmental systems. So the fact that we can flow outside of economics per se is a real asset for the concept of an embedded economy. And the reason that we can be so general is because of these two common denominators, what all groups need to be both well-governed and adaptable. So next slide. Here's 4 examples of some of our publications. This one on the top left in PNAS gives our general approach. And then we have topic areas of clinical psychology, spirituality, represented by Teilhard de Chardin. And the first implementation I did in my city of Binghamton was at an at-risk high school for education. And so this is an example of how it can be applied. Every one of these areas needs to have the same kind of rethinking that the New Paradigm Coalition is centered on for economics and business. So next slide, Julian. So here are 3 of our main areas. One is to be an actual scientific organization, theoretical framework, to actually apply this in real world settings, and in the process create communities of practice, which now number over 1,000 people in over 30 countries, as we'll see. And the next slide. And a communication dimension, which is served in part by our online magazine, This View of Life, which I think might be the internet's best kept secret in terms of a source for generalized Darwinism. It's been in operation for ever since the beginning of the Evolution Institute, and it's a real trove of information on evolutionary science and all of its applications. That's accessible, basically, that's strongly anchored to the academic literature, but far more accessible. So think of it like Atlantic or Harper's or the New Yorker, that sort of level of discourse, but from a unified evolutionary perspective. Next slide, Juliet. And so two of our basic scientific research initiatives have to do with the two major components of generalized Darwinism, multi-level selection and dual inheritance theory. And when we work on our projects, this comes easily to me as an evolutionary biologist, that working with basically in the context of the natural environment. So that's working with people in the context of their everyday lives. And this enables basic and applied research to take place in parallel rather than sequentially. And each of these initiatives here are basically like the New Paradigm Coalition. They're structured in the same way. They have weekly meetings. They form into subgroups. They result in a gallery of presentations, but their focus is a little bit more on the academic side of things, but also in a way which is highly relevant in an applied sense. And members of the NPC are very welcome to join these initiatives as well. Next slide, Juliet. So our basic strategy, which is what we've done with the NPC, assembled a relevant community with multiple forms of diversity in mind, create a framework for ongoing online interactions, a respect variation in bandwidth is like super important, because to take our case, we have probably over 100 members now. They don't all show up for a meeting, and they don't need to. So we want to accommodate all the full range of bandwidths, basically. Create early accessible content, which we can do. We don't have to wait a long time for content. Differentiate into co-created projects, and then finally, academic outputs can take place over the longer term. But a lot is taking place in public before then. Next slide, Juliet. So I end with just emphasizing, as I often do on cultural catalysis, the idea that multi-level cultural evolution is taking place all around us, whether we want it to or not. If we don't manage it, then the perverse alchemist will take place. We'll get lower forms of cooperation that are problematic at higher scales. Rates of cultural evolution not fixed, but can be accelerated. And so this quote is not my own. It's from Bob Chapman, who's the CEO of Barry Waymiller, one of these amazing conscious capitalism companies, who himself says that cooperation can spread as fast as COVID. And I love that quote. Next slide, Juliet. I think this might pass to you. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so David mentioned before a little bit of the evidence-based process. This kind of underlies everything that we do throughout ProSocial world, and is often kind of named our ProSocial approach. So this is just a little graphic to kind of go over the essential four processes that we go through in our training and our research and our initiatives as well. So this starts at that individual personal level, eventually grows to the collective vision of the group in question. And as David mentioned, this can be any group, any context, any size, and eventually moving towards that shared action and that action learning. So when you kind of boil it down to these main foundations, you can see how this applies in so many of those different contexts and uses, including our coalition today. And this informs our research as well. If we can go over as well, David, if you want to preface this a little bit.
Yeah, we have this article titled above, which includes 2 case studies that were done early on by Robert Stiles. And just to be brief about it, he worked with a government agency in Australia, two government agencies in Australia, using an early version of this process. And what makes it outstanding is that the Australian government gives a survey to all of its public service employees on a yearly basis, which enabled us to compare these two agencies with all other agencies in Australia. And what we found was not only a huge effect size, um, but also as over the years, now 7 or 8 years later, we found further improvement. So not only did the intervention work, but the cultural transformation was enough so that these agencies continued to perform well and even improved upon themselves over the course of years without intervention. So this is really solid proof that this cultural change effort worked at the scale of two sizable government agencies in Australia.
And Sage can go over a little bit of the work of our research team and how this applies there as well.
Yeah, so we also have really crystallized the kinds of, I should put in the chat a link to our research tool, which we have recently dubbed the ProSocial Insights tool, that we're actively recruiting groups, communities, organizations to pilot different forms of applied participatory research using this. And so, you know, with our own research staff, we can guide various parts of the research design process. But in particular, this tool was made to support a research commons, in the sense that everything that is created using this tool, from different kinds of survey instruments to analyses to reports, including different types of projects and groups within the tool, all of this now is reusable by any other future group in some future project. And so the more that we all participate in the work of taking seriously a scientific, evidence-based approach to cultural change, then this will help facilitate that. And it's also designed in alignment with the kind of overarching tenets of open science, making it easily accessible to all participants to get their data, to, you know, try their own analyses, whatever they want to do. So we've built this in a way that we hope we can offer increasingly to different communities, and we already use it within our courses and have piloted in different ways for our various projects. And what's still on the table is kind of convening more of our community into this space so that we can really learn for each other. And my dream is that we'd have a public project going that just pulses out every other week or once a month, a kind of pro-social, you know, diagnostic, right, of prosociality and adaptability in that moment. And wouldn't that be amazing to see tons and tons of groups and how they're faring over time, and seeing the difference in their trajectories, basically. So we can go to the next slide. And I also think the overarching research approach, as well as with the research tool, is thinking of participatory research as a catalyzed evolutionary process. We could even put catalyzed conscious evolutionary process, in the sense that to do participatory research is to ask the question, how do we know what is working? And so we could think of research in terms of the three components of evolution, and that we generate by coming together and working and measure variation in our behavior and culture. And we can identify and then select what is working and replicate them and adapt them to context. And in doing this, with a keen eye towards doing science, we take a lot of the guesswork about often somewhat opaque social processes, and especially across contexts. So you can go to the next slide. You just kind of, these are just some examples of some of the what the research tool, you know, this is like an online report that, you know, anytime anybody takes another response, we'll update. You did the next one, Juliet. Different kinds of just kind of being a little flashy here about, various types of, you go to the next one. Language networks, comparing science and spirituality, use, looking at things over time. So all kinds of stuff. We could do anything. It's an open book, but framed within the participatory research, conscious cultural evolution, intersection. There's a lot of potential here that remains to be tapped. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So a big reason that we wanted to kind of share this with this group is to get an idea of the scope of what the organization does, but also some tangible outputs of the application of the work. So currently ProSocial, including this group, functions completely remotely, worldwide scope. So through our facilitator and our training programs, we've offered quite a few of these over the years. Our current facilitator list, we've trained over 800 people at this point in 35 countries. I want to say 6 continents. Still trying to get to Antarctica. Haven't quite cracked that one yet. So some of our introductory offerings. So we offer Becoming ProSocial. And this is a little bit of our introductory offering. So this goes over those 4 core processes that we saw earlier. And this is a 7-week process where we work with individual participants to introduce these core principles and kind of work through depending on your context and your individual goals. And this has been a really rich kind of community offering where the individuals have really learned a lot from each other through past cohorts as we've seen. So this course is actually starting in October, so I can provide more information for that if anyone is curious. And this tends to lead really nicely as a funnel into leading ProSocial. It's not a necessary prerequisite, but leading ProSocial is focused specifically for people that want to work with ProSocial in a coaching or facilitation capacity. So in order to lead groups or lead the creation of groups, so any sort of leadership or facilitation experience is typically what a participant enters leading ProSocial for. So again, we work through these skills specifically with that kind of coaching mentality. And we have many, many well-trained experts that kind of coach you through this and work through this in real life application as well. And this one's also starting this September. Again, I can provide information if anyone's wondering or answer any questions about that. And sort of what we've referred to as our flagship offering through our trainings program is the ProSocial Action Lab. So true to the ethos of the organization, this one's really focused on groups and teams. So as opposed to the other ones, which you can complete as an individual to go through the process, this is intended for groups or teams to kind of go through the ProSocial process together. So through this action lab, each team is paired with a personal ProSocial coach, and they work with you to kind of lead you through the process and really come up with actionable plans and strategies to exit the course with. And this one's a little bit longer at 10 weeks. So again, can answer any questions there. It can be a little bit maybe confusing to kind of figure out where to start. So this is in the slide deck as well, just to kind of get a sense of where in the journey to get started or what might be the best fit for any individual person, depending on their context and their goals. So we'll provide this as well. Okay, so this is really our intention in bringing this to the New Paradigm Coalition is to kind of give this group a sense of the scope and the resources and the services that as representatives of the organization that we can bring to this coalition. So we really wanted to kind of put this in the context of this group and figure out exactly what we can do to best serve the New Paradigm Coalition. David or Sage, do you have any additional context to add here?
Not me, no. Thank you, everyone.
Yep,
I'm just Sage and Julian.
Okay, so let me stop sharing for a second. Okay, so I figured we can enter a couple smaller breakouts just to kind of, again, discuss this in the context of the New Paradigm Coalition and once again, get to know each other all better.
Julia, could you post that question in the chat?
Yeah, will do.
And then make sure that the three of us are in different groups.
All right, I'll get us started. So we can do about 10 minutes. You should be getting a notification in just a second to join your breakout room.
Right.
It's cut off.
Sorry, Ted, we just cut you off there.
Cut David off, which I always thought was kind of appropriate. That when the person organizing the meeting is the one who
Appropriate to
gets
cut me
cut
off.
off.
Perfect timing then. All right, nice to see everyone.
I can finish my thought to my group that which included Randy and Chip and Gretchen, and we were talking about how this needs to be made concrete, that it's hard to understand in the abstract, and that it needs to be made concrete. And the point that I was making is that whenever we could actually establish this framework, this team of teams framework, with individuals and teams representing organizations that expect to work with each other, then it becomes quite natural and concrete, and kind of carries itself, because people like to interact on matters that are important to them. They have a lot to share once you connect them and so on, even before you get to specific instruction. So the limiting factor often is getting support to set that up. When we do, then it tends to carry itself. And then I guess I'll also like to make a point about what I call the commitment divide, where on one side of the divide, it's like, I'm too busy, I can't add more. And on the other side of the divide is like, I just love this, I can't get enough. And it is possible to carry people across that divide. And when you do, then of course you're where you want to be. So so those are some of sharing of my experience.
Ted?
Yeah, just a few things from that initial presentation. I saw like the approach was basically around economics, and then those whole other set of other areas, but there was no explicit mention of political paradigms or paradigms of understanding generally. And I think both of those areas are critical for this going forward. Another thing I think that's critical is having a definition of life that is a good basis for the a foundation for this whole thing. And I've explored a great many. Like, I started this journey 62 years ago in 1962. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, I just made a decision, there has to be a better way, and I need to search for it. And I've been consciously doing that ever since. And I first started consciously designing memeplexes and releasing them in 1978. And I adopted the habit of every time I saw a hitchhiker, I would pick them up, and I drove a lot for work. So I picked up a great many hitchhikers, and I would infect them and release them into the environment and see how long it took for the memeplex to return back to me.
They're very much influenced by Richard Dawkins back then.
Oh, very much. I loved Richard's writing. It was so clear, but I just couldn't see how he could write all that information there and not see that cooperation was fundamental to complexity emerging. And he still doesn't see it. I've argued with him one-on-one twice, and he doesn't get it. But it was obvious to me from first reading Selfish Gene. It's the only book I've ever read cover to cover twice in one day, because I read it through, thought, cooperation's fundamental, but Richard hasn't explicitly stated that. Have I made a mistake? So I had some food and went back and read it cover to cover again, and decided, no, I haven't made a mistake. Richard's wrong. But his writing style, there. I just loved.
Long story. Happy to go the distance. Sage.
The other thing that I saw in that presentation was your generate function. It needs a sort function to be there at the same time. So it needs to both check for known dangerous strategies in what's being generated, and to ensure that there are effective cheat detection and cheat mitigation strategies embodied and involving in whatever system you set up. Because without both of those, things can derail very quickly. So those were just the comments on the presentation that I noted while you were making it.
Thank you.
Oh, the definition of life that I got sidetracked on. That is, like, the best definition I have now is that life is any system capable of exploring the space of the possible for the survivable. And that recurses well through physical systems, like based on DNA or RNA, which use replication with variation as the sort mechanism, or to more conscious systems, which can use any of a vast, potentially infinite range of search and sort algorithms. But there's a really interesting thing to come out of database theory about 15 years ago, which is that for a fully loaded processor, the most efficient search algorithm possible is the fully random search. And that's when you get that, and then you start looking at how brains have evolved, that degree of randomness, there's actually a very strong theoretical reason for that randomness to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, that all kinds of neural Darwinism and the like. Sage, did you have a?
I just wanted to highlight, we've obviously given a lot of attention to evolutionary theory and generalized Darwinism as one part of the philosophy of science, but the other one comes from contextual behavioral science, which is deeply linked to evolutionary science and theory. And there, the philosophy of science keywords to look up is functional contextualism, which is basically evolutionary processes within the daily life and life history of any individual person, group, or organism. And it's, yeah, functional contextualism. So, and they actually, the contextual behavioral scientists take a very strong stance on paradigms of knowledge, of how you come to know things, what they're, and they're not at all interested in ontology as much as in pragmatic knowledge, on knowledge and context. So it's a taster.
Okay.
Chip, and then I'll make a comment after you, Chip and Gretchen.
So, Ted, you referenced the need to talk about politics, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, we are both by training political scientists who have morphed into peace builders, which are surprisingly different fields. The challenge we face, at least in this country, less so than in New Zealand, which has actually made more progress along these lines than most countries, is to insert the kinds of ideas that the three of them talked about into political discourse. And as came out in our small group, we went in to see someone that David has met at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is very much the heart of the beast in American foreign policy making on Friday. And I was delighted by how open Stuart Patrick, not to be confused with Patrick Stewart, was with what David and we talk about. And so I found myself, and if I had time in our small group, I would have mentioned something that I've heard David mention a couple of times, but we've never really dealt with. And that's Stuart Kaufman's notion of the adjacent possible, or the idea of positive deviance that David mentioned once, that I tend to prefer calling them bright spots. Where are the places where you can engage people where they are most open to hearing new things, which in the United States right now is not Gaza. It's almost anything but Gaza. That doesn't mean we don't want to have conversations about it, but that's not where people are most open. Surprisingly, especially in dealing with conservatives now, climate change, when posed not as Al Gore would have done it, but in terms of what is actually happening to our daily lives, floods, fires, the end of agriculture in West Texas, you're beginning to see people open. And so how do you go from there? I'm not really sure, but a network like this one that is not associated left or right, not necessarily associated with a single country, and finally, and maybe most importantly, not associated with a single issue the way I am around peace building, can really have significant impact, which may be a good segue for David.
Yeah, now I'm caught trying to organize my thoughts. On the New Paradigm Coalition website, we say that this does not slot into any current political position. It's not left, right, or libertarian. Draws upon the valid elements of all three. I think that we have yet to put that into good action, I think. And one thing that we are starting to do is to actually study this from the perspective of libertarianism, and to show that actually this is quite friendly to liberalism for sure. If we want to go back now to the big philosophical issues and so on, which I'm actually working on quite intensely now, just the whole tradition of the Enlightenment project and liberalism. And I'm currently reading a biography of John Stuart Mill just for that purpose. So, and I actually do think authentically that this is a reframing or a new foundation for liberalism, which combines freedom and autonomy and certainly markets of the right sort with the social good. So I think that in the first place, I think that this does definitely enter the political arena. That's point one. And point two definitely heads into answering the big questions. Our major funding comes from the John Templeton Foundation, which is all about asking the big questions. And and of course, it easily becomes biological because it emanates from the biological. So, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time talking about definitions of life and stuff like that in this context because we're focusing on economics, but we certainly can and do. So there's where I think that the deep questions, the big questions, are something which is very much part of all of this. It is for me. And the more it can be for all of us, the better. And then finally, that includes spirituality. There's a kind of a partitioning in general terms between sort of secular activities like economics on one hand and spiritual activities on the other hand. But no, let's merge them, please. And the more we can do that, the better. Let's be thoroughly bilingual. And I think that that's another project which you just have to be sensitive to context to choose a word that Sage emphasizes for contextual behavioral science, who you're talking with and how comfortable they are in speaking in a spiritual idiom or not. And I've got plenty of experience across the board on spiritual thinkers who are uncomfortable thinking in secular terms and secular thinkers who are uncomfortable thinking in spiritual terms. And thankfully, and I think this includes a lot of people here, people that are very comfortable in both. And so, and that's what we're striving for.
Ted, I see your hand up again.
Yeah. Like, there's that saying, nothing in biology makes sense without evolution. And for me, nothing in life makes sense without a definition of life. So I can't think about economics, which is how we organize our household as humanity, in a sense, without thinking about the foundation of what is life. And that's where this idea of systems searching the space of the possible comes in. And like, if I go back to the mid-70s, when you say diverse communities, I was a member of the Rationalist Society, the Humanist Society, and the Theosophical Society simultaneously. There's very little overlap between those communities. I was the only person like I was the only person who was a member of the rationalists and the humanists, and the only person who was a member of either of those and the Theosophical Society. So I was just exploring paradigms. And at one point, I was in 32 different organizations and chairman, treasurer, or secretary of 8 of them. So I've been consciously using the widest search across paradigm spaces possible for a very long time. And like in the mid 80s, I was very, very active in the top levels of Ayn Rand's groups, which were based in Texas. And in those days, you know, hand crank phone, Kim, can you connect me to dialogue in the States? And please don't listen in because you'll disturb my computer. It was a 16 baud modem, and you could see the individual characters coming up on the screen as we interacted. So, you know, this thing is, if you've got this definition of life as systems capable of searching the space of the possible, then freedom is a fundamental part of search. So you can talk to the objectivist communities, you can talk to the libertarian communities, and you've got freedom as that foundation. But it's clear that freedom without responsibility self-terminates. That just comes straight out of the systems theory. And so that gives you an in. You're talking the same language. You're talking freedom is fundamental, but then you can bring in this, you've got to bring in responsibility at every level. And to protect the system itself, you've got to have these mechanisms of cheat detection and cheat mitigation, because cheating will happen in any cooperative.
Yeah.
And the whole thing builds.
Yeah, and I think that that's where Teilhard comes in. How many people here are just familiar with Teilhard de Chardin as a quite a few? And I think that he's was a true pioneer and he stands the test of time very well. I mean, he updates very well. In one of my articles, we provide the link, it does just that. But he truly regarded the bushy tree of cultural life as like the bushy tree of biological life. And so a culture for him was a life form. And I think what we're in a position to do now is actually to update that and to truly consider the concept of groups as organisms, society as organism, a metaphor which stretches back to antiquity, but has never been, until now, able to us to be treated scientifically. What does it mean for our groups to be like an organism, complete with an anatomy, physiology, immune system, nervous system, all of that? What does that mean to be ultra cooperative like that? So I think that does basically expand the definition of life and so on and so forth. So in any case, I'm very much aligned with that. Maybe we should just have a checkout for people who haven't had a chance to speak yet, and in the few minutes are remaining. Anyone want to step forward who hasn't spoken yet?
Step forward and just say a couple of things. I think for me, thinking of like the bigger questions, I had kind of forgotten that you all were funded in large part through the Templeton Foundation. And I think that would actually be a really helpful thing to kind of think about more, and to think about through the, those bridging the divides. I think that a lot of people, I'm kind of, as an anthropologist, like constantly observing the dynamics around me, and just seeing a lot of hunger for bridging the divide, the seeming divide between the spiritual and cultural and political and environmental. And so I think that this would be building from this would be really important, and fully on board, and would love to explore more. I've actually done quite a bit of work in kind of building up programs in that way for that kind of purpose. So I'd love to explore.
Can you see that becoming an
together.
important part of the new paradigm coalition, Emily? I wonder, I mean, so that basically having more of a presence in these meetings, that could point you to other sectors of pro-social world, but the really interesting question is how much we should be importing that into the NPC. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think so. I think that to me, the NPC in some ways is like the bigger picture, and how to kind of transcend the divides. Chip always talks about connecting the dots, and I think that there's a reason that he was drawn to this and brought me into the fold as well, because it feels to me that that's a large part of the work here, is connecting those divides. So.
Yeah. I think at one point that could be made, and it could be made scientifically, that when a group does have a very strong purpose, and basically the core design principles has a very strong sense of purpose, and the other structural elements which cause it safe to be pro-social, that just calls forth the whole spiritual mindset. Basically, the individual almost spontaneously thinks they're part of something larger than themselves. They want to serve it. They willingly subordinate their narrow self-interest to it. They'll use words like sacred, worship, which are all religious words, but not confined to religious. So I think that to think of the spiritual mindset as the actual state of mind of being part of something larger than yourself, and it might have a secular expression, it might have a religious expression, but that's what it is. And I think that's a wonderful thing to reflect upon, basically, and of course to try to produce.
Yeah.
How about others Anne, do you have anything there? Okay. I know you're.
Yeah, I shared with Sage. I was for me, paradigm has to do with history of science and the scientific methodology that we use. And I'm a bit confused sometimes because we talk about this new paradigm, but then we want to still do science based on data and the classical peer review. One of the reasons why the things I develop, I co-create with students, often get rejected by peer reviewers because they want the methodology to be based on more data. And if you're talking about what Stuart Kaufman calls like the next phase, the space of probabilistic, and explore that and develop this vision of what the future could be, because it's not just an extrapolation of the past, and use that paradigm to think about, for example, One Health. It gets all rejected. And it was also when we had this session I think it was 2 months ago, somebody from the London School of Economics who said, well, we give the students a course in biology and we're very successful because then they go on to, what was it, Wall Street or something.
Yeah,
and I was like, but are they going to Wall Street to shift finance, or are you just saying even with the course in biology, they're champions in the extractive model? So I'm honestly, the basic question, how can this be, how can this help us forward? I work a lot with students, and I treat them as the citizens of the future, organizing parliaments of the citizens of the future, where they discuss among themselves what the kind of next phase of evolution, whatever you want to call it, what kind of future do we want? And that then is like the filter that they use to select what data from the past, what scientific data help them to get there or not. But it's in two phases. It's we have the time space is the probabilistic space, as Stuart Kaufman really explains, and of course we have the data of the past, of what has materialized in the past, and that creates a certain path dependency, but it does not determine the future. And if we want to shift in paradigm, the focus has to be on this on the part that we have not explored so far, on the possibility that it could be different, that it could be regenerative again, that something new could emerge. And so it's all, I always find it difficult if we say, and now we're going to do that in a scientific way, and then fall back on the old paradigm. So I'm afraid, I'm new in this group, and I'm really happy that this reflection is going on, but I'm still searching, I don't know, I don't have a concrete answer saying, this is what we could do, or I have many questions and I'd be happy to keep discussing them.
I think so. I'd like to feature that. I think if you could give a presentation and that would represent this, which is lacking from some of the other presentations, that's just telling you about the heterogeneity of the field. I mean, some of the people we have in this group are very mainstream economists, and so they're doing it their way. And then we have people that are renegade economists, they would call themselves, and the fact that our tent is big enough so that we could all be pretty cordial with each other, I think is very important. But I think, when you were talking, it was reminding me of a lot of what Sage and Juliet and I, just in the hour preceding, was talking about participatory modeling and stuff like that, which is, very evolutionary, but not what you would recognize as mainstream peer review science. And so I would love to think that there's ample room for your perspective. And I think that last week's seminar by Farananda and Arthur, I thought was like nicely sort of expanding beyond the mainstream economics perspective that we've had in some of our preceding talks. But Peter, you've been active on the chats, but I wonder if you could just speak some of the main points that you've been making to wrap us up.
Well, maybe briefly. Let's see. So, well, I'm inspired by the continuous, reintegration of other disciplines and other streams of inspiration that we wouldn't normally discuss in other new economics groups. And so some of the thoughts I was just including about Dussel was just, Enrique Dussel, who was Latin America's kind of the founding father of liberation theory, developed concepts like 50 years ago that have been, developed and I think influence thinking today. And so he was a Teilhard scholar with his PhD, but then started developing liberation theory in a way that it took the stance of what he calls transmodernity, which is that in developing countries, they need to develop modernism before postmodernism. So he was an anti-postmodernist, but he also took into account economics in a very, so somebody who's a philosopher who's also dealing with the integration of spirituality saw economics as you had described it, as embedded within the society and as necessary to be seen as something that the society benefited the society, and that also, it'd say that the spiritual aspect of that was also that it needed to, that an economic theory should lead to the social, human, and spiritual well-being of the people in that society. And his ideas have influenced Mexico a lot. He was the director, so he was a rector at UNAM, not of the whole school, but in the program that he taught in, but also was very influential with Mexico's current and first progressive president, AMLO. Lopez Obrador, and now his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, their first female president. And so his ideas have influenced the way, the direction of this country, and as well as probably influenced his son, who's probably the leading, also Enrique Dussel, who is a mainstream but socialist economist working on the relationship of Mexico to China. Which is also, so he's not taking a liberation theory approach, but an economic development approach. And so these come together in some ways that I think are, we have to kind of keep weaving these ideas into the conversation so we can be reminded that these other areas, both in conventional economics, which is changing hugely, especially in economic trade and in global economic development and multipolarity, and in political development in other countries. So we often have kind of an Anglo focus or a Western focus here. But, you know, I'm reminded every day that, you know, Mexico is really, you know, a
Well,
success in a different direction.
Yeah, the idea of forming hubs all around the world and is a very important part of what we're doing, and actually succeeding to a degree. So as you know, Peter, Tech and Tech Monterey, and there's a concentration of people there. There's you, there's Raj Sisodia, and there's others that could make that a center for this kind of thing. Dennis and I are working on South Africa becoming a center because it's in part because it's the presidency of the G20, the next presidency of the G20.
Yeah.
Brazil is the current presidency of the G20.
And BRICS.
And so,
and they're both
what's that?
BRICS. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that I think is something that's very much on the agenda to do that. And so these are very exciting. Well, I think we should probably call it a day. Thank you for joining us and staying a few minutes late.